Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
And we do post a video every Friday, so if you want to know what our continuing adventures might be, do hit subscribe and follow our adventure.
And don't forget our Monday shorts. If you've got a question you'd like to ask me, put it in the comments below. And every Monday we answer somebody's question in 60 seconds.
Well, you do, I don't. I just read them out, but that's my skill in life.
There you go.
But now, Stephen, it is a chilly autumn afternoon. We're in a beautiful garden upon Mount Macedon. What are we doing today, though?
Going to France.
Ah, wonderful. And we're going to France in spring or late spring.
Yes. And today we're going to look at a series of formal French gardens that are mainly around in Normandy, which is well known for its chateaux and formal French gardens. So there you go. So Normandy and the Loire Valley are two of the famous parts of France where these formal gardens tended to congregate.
Well, there you go. Without further ado, let's dive in. Where are we going first?
All right, well, we're going to visit one that is a reproduction formal garden around an original chateau called Château de Sassy. And the main body of the garden is a classical French formal garden. You look down upon it from the house, which is, of course, what they were nearly always done.
Okay.
Because they were formal parterres,
Yeah.
they look more interesting when you can see the geometry of them from above.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And they are very symmetrical and very monochromatic.
Yes, they don't tend to use a lot of colour. In some places they use coloured gravels and things, but a lot of the parterre gardens are all about trimmed box, toperied yew, gravel, and it's all about the geometry and man's control of nature. And that's really what it was all about. It all started off with the likes of Le Notre and some of his compatriots, and it's to show human control over nature. They wanted to push nature back because, of course, nature was scary. There were wild boar out there.
Literally.
Yeah, quite literally. And so they didn't want to incorporate nature into their living habitat. They wanted their surrounds to be all made by human hands and look that way.
Are we talking at a particular era? You said this one had been replanted, but it was in the style of. So when were these gardens originally in favour in terms of the style, or have they ever gone out of favour?
Well, they haven't really gone out of favour. I mean, there's fewer of them being made now in France, but there are any number of reproduction ones that have been put around chateaux where the old formal garden had disappeared for whatever reason. I mean, revolutions sometimes get in the way. You know.
The odd revolution.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, those things happen. And of course, people's fortunes go up and down as well. So these gardens can be quite labour intensive. The hedging needs trimming regularly. The gravel needs raking and weeding. There's a lot to keep them really smart and sharp looking, and that's what they should be. So they come and go, but they were very popular back in the last of the French kings' eras. So the Louis were all very, very fond of them. And of course, Versailles was held up as the pinnacle of French formal gardens, although I have to say I prefer Vaux-le-Vicomte myself. But anyhow.
So that's sort of the 17th to 18th centuries.
And it was all about the formal shapes of gardens, and it was also about vistas, formal bodies of water, fountains, you know, anything that could show your taste and wealth. And that's what it was about.
And I guess we also looked at formal Spanish gardens, and very similar because they all actually sort of really started in Italy with that sort of Renaissance garden.
Yeah, well, they go back even further. They're really Islamic gardens, a lot of them. You know, the formal canals, the trimmed plants, all that sort of stuff dates right back to the Islamic gardens. And so the French gardens, the Italian gardens, the formal Spanish gardens, they've all got their roots back in Islamic times.
Interesting. Now, box, Stephen Ryan.
Yes.
Obviously, #touchwood, box blight and the moth hasn't arrived in Australia. Your point is it's a question of time.
Well, it is often with these things.
But obviously it is wreaking havoc is it in North America as well as Europe? I think it has jumped across the Atlantic, I'm not sure.
I don't know, to be honest, and that's something one of our American viewers might be able to tell us. But certainly it's causing all sorts of grief in Britain and right through Europe. And of course, that's where all of these formal gardens evolved. And box was the ideal shrub for trimming for low hedges because it's slow growing. So you normally only had to trim it once a year. It was a nice dark solid green, so it gave very good strong lines in gardens. And of course, the issue now is that if they're going to keep the box, then they're going to have to spray and be very vigilant about dealing with both the box caterpillar and the box blight, which is a fungal disease that's attacking from another front. And if they don't keep on top of it, they'll lose their box. And the problem at the moment is that there's no real obvious candidate of another shrub out there that doesn't get the box blight or the caterpillar that has all of the features that box has.
And I guess too, we've seen in sort of the limited gardens where it's used here that box can also take shade. So as a hedging and formality, it can transition into the shadier bits of the garden, so you can still maintain those lines.
Yeah, it can, although it's never quite as dense in the shade as what it is out in the sun. But its growth pattern tends to stay much the same, so the overall effect is pretty well there.
And funnily enough, I was looking through an old book about Portuguese gardens, I think it was, and to the north of Portugal particularly, where it's very moist but quite temperate. And there was some box that had just been allowed to grow, and it was the most beautiful small tree, very sort of wild and romantic, dripping with leaves, an understory tree, but it was absolutely beautiful. And actually it's inspired me just to get one box and just let it grow.
Yeah, well, you could, and in fact the world's tallest box hedge is at Birr Castle in Ireland, and I think it's about 30 feet tall.
Wow.
So it's very old, and I have to say it might be the biggest box hedge in the world, but it's not the tidiest and most attractive box hedge I've ever seen in my life, but I think it's in the Guinness Book of Records. So there you go. So box can actually get surprisingly big given time.
There you are. Okay, Stephen, where to now?
All right, well, we're going to visit another chateau that I have, I have a passion for them all, I have to say, but this one is a particularly interesting garden, and that's Château de Brécy. And unlike the other French gardens, as I mentioned before, generally the parterre garden is placed below the house so that you can look out either from a terrace or from the upstairs windows and look down over the patination there.
And now you've said that, look, remembering images of big, grand country houses, chateaus, they are all elevated, either through having been built on a plinth or actually from a high point in the landscape.
Yeah, they tend to do that because, of course, it adds to the grandeur of the whole effect. So it's all about showing off your wealth and the grandeur of your property, so that when visitors come, they're mind blown by the beauty of it all. Bressi is really interesting because it's almost a reversal of all of the things that you would normally expect of a French formal garden. The chateau itself is at the bottom of the hill, and you actually walk into the chateau through an open courtyard with just gravel. There's no planting or anything like that. It's just a big open gravel area where you would have spun your horse around, I guess.
Right round, baby, right round.
And when you go out the back of the chateau, the formal garden actually goes up in terraces above the house.
So does that mean it's sort of softer because you're meant to experience it by walking through it, not looking down on it?
It's
have
still
a different feel?
It has a very different feel, although it's still a very formal garden. So there's a lot of formality about it. There's lots of toperied yew and box. They've even used a couple of evergreen oaks for topiary, so there's a little bit of quirkiness going on. A few different sort of plants that have been used by the owners. But it's a discovery garden. Because you're going up through the terraces, you'll come up a set of stairs, you'll discover the next terrace, but you can't really see the one above. Right. So, and most of it is not visible from the bottom at the house, except for the gates at the top of the terraces. So you've got this set of stairs that run all the way up with this amazing set of wrought iron gates with the sky outlined behind.
Sounds like heaven. Now, while we're halfway through our journey, we should actually just say why you were there and with whom.
Ah, yes.
Stephen Ryan, why were you in the gardens of France?
All right, well, it's something that I do on a regular basis. I take tours to gardens in different parts of the world. This was our Northwest France tour, so we had Normandy and Brittany, and it was a 21-day tour, and we had to eat good food, drink good wine, visit things like the Bayeux tapestries and the Beaux-Arts at Rouen, all those sorts of fabulous places that you can visit. And I do it for a company called Australians Studying Abroad.
Now, you don't need to A, be an Australian or B, study. It's basically a tour company with experts which cover art, design, gardening,
yes, the whole
food,
thing.
I think, too.
Yes, there's chemistry, there's literature.
Not going on that.
Yeah.
I'm already triggered to my high school days of chemistry. Let's not go on that one, viewers.
No.
But we'll put the website below and the link below. And Stephen is actually just about to head off to Madeira on a garden tour, which is fully booked. Needless to say, I'm not invited, but never mind. You can go as well. So you don't have to be in Australia or a student. Basically, it's for anyone who's interested. So we'll put the links below and you can see the calendar for the next year, I think.
At least, maybe even longer, because certainly in 2025, I'm off to Normandy and Brittany again. So the gardens we're looking at on this video, in fact, will probably be part of that tour again.
There you go. Okay, next, Stephen.
All right, well, Château de Boutemont is another beautiful house. It's really more a large house than a classical over-the-top chateau, and it's sitting in a grass moat, which makes it quite an interesting layout.
Yes.
And it's on undulating land.
Obviously, it wasn't designed to be a grass moat.
No, it's probably designed to be a water moat.
A watering moat.
Yeah, initially, but now it's a grass moat, much more friendly and easy to manage.
I don't know, maybe just a body of water is really easy, you just leave it.
Well, maybe, but you know.
You've got to mow the grass, Stephen.
Yeah, but you've got to clean the water occasionally. But anyhow, this chateau is a little bit of a melding of styles. It has distinctly formal areas. It has some lovely topiary, beautifully trimmed shrubs and trees and things, but it also has a little bit more of relaxed parts of the garden. So it's probably got a little bit of the English romantic style garden incorporated into what is basically a comparatively formal French garden. It's also not on the sort of land that lends itself to large formal gardens, because you need comparatively flat spaces. Even if it's on a hill, you've got to be able to create those flat terraces and things. This is very undulating and gently rolling land. So they've actually worked with the actual design of the garden, working it into the form of the land quite nicely. It also includes quite a lot of collector's plants. So again, it's not just the box and yew and things that you expect of a really formal French garden.
So, of these gardens that you were looking at, what is their sort of status now? Are they still privately owned, or are they sort of institutions now, or like the National Trust in Britain, is it still someone who's having to maintain it?
In most cases, it is someone. Certainly, Sassy and Bressi are both still gardens that belong to a family. But the French inheritance rules make things rather difficult, because every child that you have is allowed to have their share of the property. So, of course, when you have a large clutch of children and you've got a large chateau, you can't leave it to the eldest son type thing, as was done in Britain for generations. So it gets to the point where nobody can manage the properties. They become a bit of a white elephant as far as the current generations are concerned. And I certainly know that one or two of them are teetering because they're not quite sure how to deal with successional plans with regards to these properties. And so many of them will possibly go up on the market to be bought. I think the French government is hesitant to take over too many of these places unless there's a lot of money that's been bequeathed with them, because although they are quite popular as tourist attractions, they really don't pay their own way as an open garden scheme thing. They don't have the same sort of national trust system in France that they have in Britain. So some of these chateaux are again at serious risk of disappearing over the next generation unless they're bought up by somebody with wealth and taste that can carry them through. So I haven't got the wealth.
But you have the taste, alas, Stephen, alas, alas.
So, you know, it's what it is. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve in France over the next decade or 2 decades, as some of these people get a little too old to manage their properties. Who knows what's going to happen next.
But now there are always silver linings, so there are modern formal gardens. So where are we going now?
All right, well, this is one of, well, can I say one of my favourite gardens?
You can, you just did.
I just did, but I probably shouldn't, because they're all beautiful and fabulous in their own right. But Château de Plume is a really interesting garden in several ways. One, it started off as a nursery, and the owners were plant collectors, and they decided to create a garden around the nursery, as many nursery owners do. And so they've nodded to formal French gardens in the way that they've laid out some of their garden.
And you can see there's a lot of monochrome, there's a lot of symmetry, a lot of clipping,
Yep.
but not in the same manner.
No, they've used, instead of having hedges, although there's some fabulously trimmed hedges in this garden, but the main body of the garden runs out from the house, and it's actually a checkerboard sort of pattern of mown and unmown grass. So you've got these squares of unmown grass, which has got lots of perennials and wildflowers growing in it. And as you get further away from the house, it is less managed. And so closer to the house, there's lots of perennials and quite showy things.
Yeah.
As you go down further and further towards the fields out from the garden, the actual squares are more just unmown grass. And anything that finds its way in there, that's fine. If a tree does, it gets hoiked out though. So it's all got to be about the grasses and the wildflowers and things, hence Château de Plume. They're alluding to the plumes of grasses.
There you go.
So there you go.
Very beautiful. Okay, last two, Stephen.
All right. Château de Mesnil, Geoffroy, is again a very formal chateau with formal gardens around it. Like many of these places, it's also got a walled garden, which we haven't discussed. Many of these chateaus had walled gardens. The walled gardens were there specifically to take away the vegetables and things from the formal gardens, but they were always laid out in a formal fashion anyway, but you didn't want to look at the turnips. So the formal gardens were always, you know, the big grand garden, but then you'd have a substantial wall garden where the gardeners would grow the vegetables and flowers for the house, and they were always part of these big chateaus as well.
So what you can see here though too is pollarding, so a big avenue with a lot of pollarded trees. So I always, you know, my feelings about bonsai.
Yeah.
Cutting trees, I mean, so savagely, a big tree and literally just cutting it off at the crown. Why? I mean, is it an aesthetic thing? Is it about the new growth? Why is it so popular there or in this type of garden?
Well, I think, you know, it is one of those things that, although strictly speaking, it's not like formal hedges and things, but it does create a formal-esque look because the trees are all basically pollard to the same height.
Yeah.
So you get that sort of colonnaded effect with the trunks.
It makes them more regular.
Yeah, it does. It makes them far more regular. And of course, they can manage the trees, which means that they're not going to get canopy overshadowing other parts of the garden where they don't want shade. So it's a management thing. And I think whether it started off as just a practical thing or not, I'm not sure, but it's become part of the aesthetics of the French style of gardening to see those sort of pollarded trees, coppiced things, and, you know, things that are managed and pruned and are obviously artificially manipulated.
Which brings us lastly to Australia. Here we are at Mount Master in this beautiful garden. Really, we obviously, European history in Australia is relatively short, a couple of 100 years, and gardening perhaps even less than that. So we just don't have that history of particularly monumental estates and gardens. So are any of these styles and elements relevant to us?
Well, you could well ask that question, and you did. Yes and no. I think from the Australian aesthetic of things, we don't tend to do the formal garden as much.
No.
It sometimes shows up, there's a few landscape designers around that nod to this style of gardening, and it's often useful in smallish suburban spaces because it's something you can manage, understand. You can bring in a non-trained horticulturalist to manage the paths and the trimming and so forth. So you're creating outdoor rooms, basically.
Yeah.
For me, they're not strictly speaking gardens because they're too static. They don't have enough change and interest in them. So a little bit of that formal aesthetic has sort of found its way into mainly suburban type gardens here. But certainly on larger estates and larger gardens, it tends to have been more, because of our history, I guess, we've tried to emulate more the British garden-esque type of gardening where it's much more informal. It can have its grand avenue coming in or whatever, but then you just have sweeping lawns, large specimen trees, that sort of garden-esque type thing. Wavy lines, very important. So we tended to go in that direction. I guess if the French had settled us a century or so earlier,
which they nearly did,
then we might have had a quite different aesthetic about things.
How funny, you would be a French garden specialist in Australia anyway.
Yeah, goodness knows, sacre bleu.
Absolutely, but actually just talking of that though, right behind us here is this very beautifully sort of clipped hedge. So, I mean, obviously there are hedges in Australian gardens, but we just don't have that breadth to have or the history of those massive formal
No,
gardens,
we
which
don't.
There was in Britain, and that fashion changed. And
Yeah, Capability Brown is taken to task over that one by the French. In England, he was seen as a hero of landscape design. In France, he's seen as a vandal because he wiped away virtually all of the formal French-style gardens in Britain.
there you are. Yeah. Well, if you want to see any of those formal French gardens, you might want to have a look at the website and book a trip with Steve and Ryan.
If you can
beware.
Yeah. It can be fun. We have a lot of fun when we go on these tours. And I have to say the Northwest France one has become something of one of my signature tours. So I've done it quite a few times. So I feel comfortable there, although
you know
I still
the songs, you know the dances.
Yeah, but I can't speak the language. But anyhow, we manage perfectly well. We do see some fabulous places.
Excellent. And if you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe.
Yes, and don't forget to send me questions.
Put them in the comments below and we answer them every Monday in a short. But until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.